All right. Good afternoon, or whatever time it is when you're watching this. We are now into week 6. So we are reading Julius Evola and talking about traditionalism and how it connects with democratic theory. Julius Evola is someone that I think is not read very often in political science classes. But I think his impact and influence has really grown over the last 20 years or so, and I think it's really important to sort of see what he has to say because his ideas, even though he was writing starting in like the 1930s all the way up through 20s and 30s, all the way up through the 60s and 70s, his ideas are gaining a lot of traction in the United States and abroad in Europe as well. Just one example, Steve Bannon, who was a very close advisor of President Trump, especially during his first term. Bannon has said that Julius Evola is the most important philosopher that he's ever read. So clearly, he is an influential philosopher. So even though he's less than a familiar name, I think it's someone that we should read and we should get to know what he's about and what he's interested in. So I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to Evola, the notion of traditionalism, what he means, and just kind of set the stage for the readings. And then I want you to kind of think through this lens of traditionalism. How do you understand it, and what does a politics of traditionalism look like? So that's what we're doing today. So Julius Evola, born in 1898, he was a mystic. He studied a lot of occult things. It had sort of a mystical Christianity to him, and then moved in more of a spiritualist direction. He is also a philosopher. When we talk about him as a traditionalist, and there's a long history of traditionalism, what does that mean? What it really means for Evola is that he is rejecting the modern world and its major philosophical ideas, right? And I just pulled a quote. I think this is from the first chapter. The disorder of our age manifests itself in the subversion introduced in Europe by the revolutions of 1789 and 1848. And that's really important, right? The revolution of 1789, the French Revolution, which basically created the will of the people, right? The idea that the people are the general will of the country and they should be the decision-making body, right? Not the king, not the monarchs, not the clergy, but the people. And then 1848 in Europe was really the first wave of what we might call democratic revolutions in Europe, really building on the promise of the revolution of 1789. And in between 1789 and 1848, we see really the emergence of capitalism in Europe as well, and the rise of socialist ideologies. Right, 1848, a lot of the democratic revolutions were supported by communist and socialist political parties. So what is it that he's writing against? What's he worried about? I wrote a couple of them down. You will probably, in your reading, you will see things that you might find, oh, he's also kind of writing against this, right? The first one is liberalism. And by this we mean sort of the traditional idea of liberal, not liberal like the Democratic Party is liberal, but the traditional liberalism, largely understood by Evola as individualism, right? In liberal society, we are individuals who are looking out for ourselves and our best interest, and we are people unto ourselves, right? And his big fear is if we see ourselves in that way, that liberal individualist manner, then we lose this idea of ourselves as part of a religious tradition, part of a community, a culture, that kind of thing. And he sees that as very much traditionalist ideas. And for Evola, liberalism, individualism finds its purest expression in capitalism, right? Which for him is sort of like a completely selfish, self-interested economic system. And so he's very much terrified of that. However, he is equally terrified of the rising ideals of communism in Europe at the time. And largely this is because, as you will see as you're reading this, a lot of his traditionalism boils down to a sort of defense of natural hierarchy. which we saw a little bit of last week. And but Evola really kind of creates this as the centerpiece of his idea of traditionalism, right? And communism is, in a sense, a rejection of this notion of a strictly hierarchical world, right? Well, that terrifies him, right? And democracy is somewhat the same way, right? Democracy is about individual rights rather than communal rights and communal ideas. Democracy is about equality rather than hierarchy. So these are some of the things you're going to see over and over again in his writings, where he is very much writing against this notion of individualism, capitalism, communism, and democracy, right? So as you're reading it, a lot of what he's going to do is really tell you like what traditionalism is against. Your job is, okay, figuring out here's all the stuff he's against. What does tradition look like, or what does traditionalism look like for him? Like, what is its positive contribution, right? So what does he stand for? In this sense, I think he's a little complicated. So, we probably want to go through him kind of, with some deliberate procedure here. When he talks about traditionalism, it's not simply a return to the past, right? Like, oh, let's just create the old structures of feudalism that used to exist and then we'll all be happy. Like, he doesn't want that, right? As he says, for the authentic revolutionary conservative, what really counts is to be faithful not to past forms and institutions, but rather to principles of which such forms and institutions have been particular expression, right? So feudalism was the expression of traditionalism and hierarchy, 200 years prior. It doesn't mean that we're going back to feudalism, right? Traditionalism wants to come up with a new version or a new political form that is expressive of traditionalism, right? So we're not just going back to the past. What he's looking for is sort of like the spirit of tradition, and what kind of political forms should that spirit take today, right? In the early 1900s, right? In a world where we have mass production and things like that, we're going to have new political forms. What do they look like, right? That's part of what he's getting into. So he wants to capture the spirit of tradition. What is it? Well, like I said, it's for you to determine, right? I want you to read through this and try to figure out, like, okay, A, what does he mean by traditionalism? That's the first big question of the week. And then the second big question of the week is, what does a traditionalist politics look like? What does he think it looks like, right? Compared to a democratic form of politics. Generally speaking, I think that there are three things that he's very interested in. One, traditionalism is very masculine. You're going to see that over and over and over again. It is also very much about a centralized authority. He sort of sees a country as a spiritual thing. There's a spiritual essence, and the best way to capture that spiritual essence is through central authority, right? Otherwise, that spiritual essence can be diluted, right? It's another thing he's terrified about with democracy. And then again, the notion of unity, right? Unity within a common culture, or unity within a shared framework. Again, this is where he's very much against the idea of liberalism, right? Liberalism is not just about, it's not just about who you are as an individual. You got to be part of a unit, right? Part of a nation, part of a hierarchical system. So that's another thing that he's looking for. One other thing to keep in mind, you're going to kind of see this coming up a few times. He mentions it very deliberately. He was sympathetic to fascism, and he was living through Mussolini's fascist regime. He did obviously outlive the regime. I think he died in 1978, so he was around for a while. But he himself was not, he did not identify as a fascist, largely because he felt fascism was not traditionalist enough, right? So it's sort of like he saw fascism as like a good start, right? Okay, we're talking a bit about tradition within fascist politics. We're talking a bit about centralized authority, masculine authority, but it doesn't quite go far enough, right? He doesn't think fascism rejects the modern world entirely, and that's what he's really after. So again, just a simple quote from Evola. If the fascist ideas still deserve to be defended, they should be defended not simply insofar as they're fascist, but rather insofar as they have represented a particular form of the apparition and affirmation of ideas that were older and more elevated than fascism, right? So I think it's misleading to simply say, oh, well, he's a fascist, and that helps us understand Evola. He has some affinities with fascism. He sees fascism as sort of a similar project to his, but there are ways in which he sees it as incomplete, right? Fascism is sort of a debased version of traditionalism, and he says he wants something more elevated than fascism. So as you're thinking through what a traditionalist politics looks like, it certainly shares some things that we were looking at last week. But I don't think it's reducible to them, right? And I think largely that's because whereas fascists selectively are interested in tradition and historical traditional things, Evola is interested in it in a complete way. So I think that that's really, really important. So this is sort of a little bit of a primer. Hopefully it's going to give you a sense of what the big claims that he's making are. And then, like I said, the two big questions for you this week: what do you make of traditionalism, right? And that's, I want you to answer that based on the readings of the first four chapters I give you, chapters 1 through 4. And then the final four chapters that I give you, chapters 8, 9, 12, and 16, I think that's where he starts to sketch out really the line of what a traditionalist politics looks like in the modern world, right? 'Cause he's not just like, let's recreate feudalism. It's not that. It's a new political form. Well, what does that new political form look like? So that's going to be your question for Sunday, right? So think about those two questions as you're reading him, and see kind of how he fits alongside what we read last week, but also how he fits alongside these ideas of democratic equality and freedom and things like that. Because he has again, I think, a very nuanced take, but traditionalism is very much juxtaposed to democracy for some really key reasons. Hopefully you look into that. So that's Evola in a nutshell. Enjoy the reading. I think he's actually a really great writer, and this is a good translation. So I think it's very provocative, but I think really interesting and well written. And then this week, for your weekly kind of end of week reflection, it's going to be slightly different. Like last week, I wanted you to write, a potential topic for your final paper or your podcast, which I read. Very, very good. I gave a lot of you some ideas about where you could start your research. For this week, what I want you to do is basically give me a list of 4 sources that you think you can use in your paper, and a brief description of each one. Here's the source. Here's why I think it's useful to me. Now, 2 of those sources, I want them to be readings from the semester so far. So Dewey or Wolin or Goldman or whoever we've read so far, right? 2 of those sources. And then the other 2, I want them to be sources that you found on your own through your own research. And I want these to be books or journal articles, or a well established, like a newspaper or something like that. I don't want a source to be Wikipedia or the Oxford, the Oxford Dictionary or something like that, right? I want it to be a really substantive, reputable source, right? Which basically means there should be an author attached to it. The credentials of the author should be that there should be a publication date. If there's an editorial board, that edits and oversees the editorial content, all the better. But I want to see basically the first 4 sources that you think you're going to find that are going to help you shape your topic and create a path for your paper. So that'll be the final assignment for this Sunday. So we're taking baby steps toward the paper, and then we'll keep working on that next week. So good luck with the reading, good luck with the questions, and if you have any questions for me, just shoot me an email. Okay, good luck.